I'm Ben Ryman, and this is Behaviour Speak. Charda'e Pearson is a board-certified behavior analyst and district behavior analyst supervisor with the Rockwood School District in Greater St. Louis. As a native of the north suburbs of Chicago, Charda'e moved to St. Louis, Missouri to obtain a double major bachelor's degree in psychology and human services. In 2013, she completed her Master's of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis with an emphasis on autism at the Sage Colleges, and obtained her BCBA certification in the same year. Charda'e has worked in the home setting as an ABA therapist for 4 years, and an ABA paraprofessional with a special education school for K-8 for 3 years. Charda'e has worked as a supervisor for 16 years in various capacities within the educational setting from preschool through high school. Currently, she serves as an adjunct instructor for behavior analysis coursework at 2 Missouri University and leads a team of behavior analysts in supporting a school district on the general education side with a staff growth capacity focus in meeting the educational needs of all students. Welcome to the podcast, Charda'e.
Hey, how's it going? I'm excited to be here with you.
Stoked to have you. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that I'm producing this podcast in the land of the Comox, Homoko, Clayus, and Kla'aman First Nations, and grateful to be here occupying these lands. So, Charda'e, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I think I'm originally from Chicago, the north suburbs. So I usually say Chicago in general until somebody tells me that they're from Chicago, and then I got to specify. So just to be clear, it is the north suburbs of Chicago, but nonetheless, it's about 15 to 20 minutes from the Wisconsin border. So pretty far north. So growing up in that area, I think just a little bit that was unique just in my background is I grew up in a very small suburb that was what would be considered low SES, and it was majority Black American with some Hispanics, and then we had some white people, but they were mainly, it housed the naval base. So if you're familiar with North Chicago, Illinois, the naval base actually is a main centerpiece there where a lot of the Navy people will come in and get training and then are based out of North Chicago, the naval base. And so having that experience, just growing up in a small town where you can walk around and hang out, and you come home when the street lights come home, right? Come on. And other than that, you disappear all day. And then from there, I went to my parents actually were separated. So my dad lived in a different part of town. And so high school, I went to where he lived for a couple of years for high school. And that was a big, just kind of a learning curve, a culture shock for me. But nonetheless, as I look back, I can see how it developed me quite a bit. But just to kind of give you a quick synopsis, I went to a high school that was majority white in a predominantly high SES area for 2 years. Did sports out there. So basketball, track, that's my life. Or at least it was. I'm a little old now. But with that scope, then I actually came back to the neighborhood that I grew up in that was majority Black, and loved just being home, right? And the familiarity of culture and interactions. And then from there, I actually, once I graduated, I came to St. Louis, Missouri on a basketball scholarship for Missouri Baptist University. So that's what brought me here. And then just through multiple experiences, I went from babysitting a kid with autism to really getting into the field of behavior analysis. And so now where I am is I work in our largest school district in the Missouri area as far as square footage. We service about 22,000 students, and I'm on the general education side, and I oversee a team of behavior analysts in that space.
Cool. So tell me more about sort of, and again, I don't know anything about Chicago. I don't know anything about I don't know anything about Wisconsin either, but a small town Canadian guy here, so out of the loop. But can you tell me a little bit more about sort of how the North and the West kind of shaped your childhood?
Just being out in Chicago, that area.
But you said kind of when you went from the North. First off, when you were in the North, were your folks in the military, or you just happened to be near the military base?
Yeah, we just happen to live there. So my folks actually, my mom was from Waukegan, which is about the town North Chicago is about literally neighbors to Waukegan.
Hmm.
So my mom grew up in Waukegan, Illinois. My dad was actually, he was raised in southern Mississippi. So he's a country boy,
Hmm.
and then came up in his 20s and then settled in Waukegan. And so
Yeah.
when they met, they just bought a house in North Chicago. So
Yeah.
they weren't military. It just
Hmm.
happened to be that's where we lived. And then when they split, he ended up going it was further west. It was like a northwest area, probably about 15 to 20 minutes. But in the suburbs of Chicago, or at least the north suburbs that far, the demographics can change very drastically
Hmm.
from one municipality to the next, even though they're literally like a 10-minute, 15-minute drive as you go
Yeah.
up. And so the where we lived in where I lived with my mom in North Chicago, we owned a house, there was land, you had neighbors really close, but it was also high gang related, it was high drugs, it was
Hmm.
you know I had to, like, I'd walk past a car being shot up, right, just trying to go to the library. And
Wow.
so that was kind of that community, to where my dad lived at that time in like an apartment complex, but it was also by like one of our major malls, and there's bowling and movie theater, right? So
Hmm.
it's like an area that was built up, and it fed into what we call Gurney School District.
Hmm. Okay. If you'd like to collect BCBA, IBA, or QBA continuing education credits for this episode, you'll need to enter the 3 secret words at www.cbiconsultants.com/shop. The first secret word is basketball. Gotcha, gotcha,
Very
gotcha.
different dynamics.
Yeah, yeah, gotcha. All right, cool. So then, so you spent a lot of time in basketball and track. How was school for you, outside of basketball and track, or even including basketball and track? But
Yeah, school was fun. I think the biggest shift for me was, and I kind of already mentioned, going to 2 separate high schools. And I think what was also interesting was that we were in the same conference. And so, growing up in this neighborhood, in this area from,
mm,
K through 8th. And then, I actually got into trouble my 8th grade year. And so the way it was set up was that it was a small town. So I
mm,
can't tell you how many, but
yeah,
just to give scope, it's 2 middle schools and 1 high school that
mm,
services this town.
okay,
And so the 2 middle schools come together at the high school. Well, I was part of the rival with the other middle school, and
mm,
it was this whole fight that was supposed to happen. And my mom's like, "Nope, you're going to your dad's for high school. You can't go into the high school." And so, running track and Bettman playing basketball was different
mm,
because one, I stood out, right? Like I'm like on the basketball team, I was one of 2 Black girls, and the other girl was
mm,
mixed and was a foster child of a white family.
mm,
And so for me, it was just a culture shock in that, and I'm going to say this, but I think it was just my experience
yeah,
when doing tryouts, and they were like, pass it to Sarah, pass it to Becky. Like, I had never been around that many white people. Like, I couldn't
hmm,
differentiate, right? Like
yeah,
I knew they looked different,
yeah,
right? Like I saw curly hair versus straight
sure,
hair, but I couldn't keep track of who was Sarah versus Becky. And
yeah,
then there were 3 Sarahs, and I was just like, I'm not going to make this tryout. Can't
yeah,
get to the wrong team. um, but I think and then track, there was me and one other girl, like as freshmen, trying out for track. And, as you can just imagine, right? Like having ran my area, but also just my build. Like I'm very much of a track build. And so within that, when I did tryouts, I didn't run on freshman team. Like I immediately went to varsity. And then, so within that scope, it was interesting because coming into that school, I was known very quickly because I played the sports and because I stood out. I can definitely say that had I stayed in the community where my mother was, there were so many girls that were faster than me. There's no way I would have made varsity.
Wow.
Right. So the structure of it created space for me to be popular coming in as a freshman. The limitation was I'm now going and playing against people I grew up with, right? And even then, I would go back and forth to my mom's house. so at that point, the community that I was close to now viewed me as a traitor. I would, I would go home and my dialect changed. A lot of people call it like code switching now.
Yep.
I didn't see it as code switching. I just picked up the way people talked around me, right? We talk about learned behavior, but it wasn't a conscious thing. I didn't go, ooh, I need to sound this way. I just did. Well, the shift of that dynamic, though, then created where I didn't really fit with the community that I grew up with my mom in that area. And I think the other component too is now I'm on a bus and I'm traveling with my team who's majority white, and we're going to go play in my hometown, right? Like I'm like excited, like, yes, we're playing in Chicago. And the bus pulls up and my teammates are like, can we leave our stuff on the bus? I'm a little nervous. What are there going to be security at the game? And I was just like, what? Because that was me. Those were just some of the moments where I was just like, what happened? Right. Because I never experienced that. And it was so confusing to me. Now as an adult and my experiences looking back, I can see how that unfolded, but being in that space, it was hard because this was now my community. My previous community was going, no, you sound white. You're not like us anymore. You're a traitor.
Yeah.
But then my new community was afraid of my old community. Like it was just this very weird dynamic. And as a 14, 15-year-old trying to grapple with that was heavy.
I bet. And did your new community, because it sounds like we're talking like microaggressions here. This is kind of what's happening. They're going back to your old community and going, this place is sketchy, really this place is just different is really all it was. And therefore it's sketchy and therefore it's dangerous and so on, and that sort of slippery slope. Did you have any of that like directed towards yourself too when you moved to the West? Because being like you mentioned, you're just the two of you on the team, and like were there other Black students, or was it just on the team that you were only a couple of Black folks? And so what was that experience like, I guess?
Yeah, so there were a few other Black students in the school. And so, I can't remember what the book is called, but there's a book about like the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria, right?
Yeah.
And so I did hang close. Like I quickly learned who, like, you self-identify. You start looking around and you're like, they look familiar. But I would also say some of the other Black kids notice I look lost. And so it would take me in. So I was definitely part of the Black table, right? During my lunch period. As far as just some of the interactions, different things, I think that now are definitely considered microaggressions, but I also feel like it also lends in how you receive it. So there was a lot of conversations around, do you wash your hair, and how did you get your hair puffy and now it's straight? There were confusions because there weren't a lot of exemplars. I think the fact that me and the other teammate, we were different. She was in foster care. And so her life experience, her conversation, the way she moved was very different from me. I think that, I think for me, my biggest struggle was just learning that culture, because we would have basketball parties and sleepovers, and they'd be want to play games, and I'm like, what game is this? Like, it was like, and I think it was just like maybe something like a Secret Santa, or maybe just like
Sure.
you like gag bags or whatever.
Yep.
And I was like, I don't understand. Like, why are we giving ugly gifts? Like it just wasn't part of my culture.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then I didn't have ugly stuff to give. It was just like, so there were things that even I look back in pictures, right? And I'd wear like I noticed that I saw myself shift. Like when I look back in pictures,
Mm.
I remember seeing a picture where I was with my basketball team, and I actually had my hair like this, and it was in these pigtails.
Yeah.
And then I had never wore pigtails. Like once I hit middle school, pigtails was not a thing.
Yeah.
My coat, it was just like, you're gonna wear it flat, or you're gonna curl it, and it was just you're gonna get braids. And
Yeah.
so when I look back, I see where I picked up some of the mannerisms and the
Mm-hmm.
practices.
Mm-hmm.
And even now, I get told that I switch really quickly. Like I have people that say I got a Becky voice and a Shaquita voice, and like, I switch real fast, like pinned in my mood. And even I will say, I think it wasn't. I never was bullied. I never was. I never been called the N-word. Like I never
Yeah.
experienced some of the things that, in the school district I work in, the kids of color experience. And yet I do think that part of it, I wonder if part of it was I was a basketball star, right? Like I went downstate. I took my team downstate in track my freshman year, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm the fourth anchor. And so I wonder sometimes if the influence was different.
Mm.
But then I also wasn't, though I fought in middle school and elementary, I wasn't in that high school fighting, right?
Mm. Mm. Mm.
But being with my dad, it was a different dynamic. Like
Yeah.
getting in a fight meant something different,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I do think that a lot of my behavior shifted in that environment, um, where I think I picked up their mannerisms. I can't really say there was a time that wasn't unjust necessarily. The only thing I do remember was that when my mom was registering me for school, and I was a straight A student throughout my whole life,
Mm.
and she asked for them to put me in honor classes my freshman year there. And they was
Sure.
like, oh, no, she's coming from a different location. Their curriculum is not as aggressive as ours.
Mm.
So we're going to put her in regular classes. And I
Mm.
remember um, being in reading. It was a reading, like my English class or reading
Yeah.
class,
Yeah.
ELA. And our class average grade was a D. And it was only because I had an A, and we were learning about nouns and pronouns. And I remember thinking, this school is stupid. But I think the perception, the district I came from was a very low performing
Mm.
district on paper.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So I remember that, right? That being a limitation. And then finally my sophomore year, they were like, oh, she needs to be in honor classes.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
amongst the student body, it was just more of the experience.
Yep.
It was more of the exposure and the shift. And I really struggled because during the week I'd go home to my mom, or on the weekends. I really
Yep.
struggled going home, right? And they're like, you sound white. You're not like us. That was harder than
Yeah.
being in the white community for sure.
Yeah. For sure. It makes me wonder about ending it. I'm just going to write this down because I'd like to find someone that's maybe involved in kind of researching code switching.
Mm.
Because I mean, obviously code switching is a thing and legit, but I also wonder if, some of code switching, you know, stems from experiences like yours where folks are just put into different environments. Because I remember when I first moved out of the house or out of the hometown, the first place I went to was Montreal
Mm.
in Quebec, and I lived there for about a year. And Montreal, for those that are familiar, Quebec's our only kind of fully French province, and Montreal's a big French speaking city. And I remember quite quickly, I started developing this sort of pseudo French accent when I was talking in English. Or I would start speaking French in places where I didn't even know I knew the words for. Um, but more so, I started having this French accent, and I've also noticed, sort of from time to time, just when I'm talking to anybody with a different accent, I'll catch myself starting to switch to their accent as I'm talking to them. I don't realize I'm doing it, and so it makes me wonder if some of this code switching again.
So that is no misunderstanding. And yet I can, in that same meeting, if there's a parent of color in that meeting, especially a Black parent family, I will go from talking to the teacher in a certain way who's a white woman and immediately switch my vernacular and my
Yeah.
tone and my
Wow.
cadence. Like, so for me, like that's code switching, right? By
Yeah. Yeah.
experiential learning and being conscious. Um, and not that I want to talk to this Black parent as a Black person. It's just I
Hmm.
resonate. And so I switch to where in high school, I couldn't switch back, on the weekends. And so that's where I think some of it's just learned. But
Yeah.
again, some can argue unconscious. I did not experience a sense of
Yeah.
insecurity. I was just more like, I don't know who Sarah and Becky. And I see people that look like me, so I'm going to go over there.
Hmm.
And I run my sport, I play my game, and everybody thinks I'm a great athlete. And
Yeah.
like, I was winning. It wasn't a sense of insecurity or survival, at least
Yeah.
consciously at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. That really makes me want to dig more into code switching now, because we'll move on from this in a second. But I had always sort of, from what little I knew, thought this was a thing that, occurred when you, kind of as you described, but when you switch from sort of, one kind of culture to another, like from black to white, I think is mostly what this is used, the terms used, as far as I know. But to see it happening with a black person and a white person in the room at the same time, because I've always learned about it as sort of being sort of a safety type behavior, right? And so, but yet you're still in the presence of the folks you just switched from over to these other folks. That's like an interesting little dynamic there, that sort of like, means there's got to be someone that researches this stuff. And if you're
Yeah.
listening, send me an email, because I want to talk to you.
Or maybe I just introduced a new idea.
Maybe
Maybe. I don't
so. Yeah. Maybe they'll be sending you an email. Uh, Join our study, Charda'e. Right on. Okay, so you kind of blasted through the other question I usually ask of babysitting an autistic person. Now I run a team of behavior analysts. I like to hear the story about sort of babysitting autistic person and beyond. So how'd you get into this field?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a broke college student. It was
Yeah,
my freshman year. So we're talking '03,
yeah,
right? And
yeah.
so there was these signs up that you can, parent needed a child, somebody to babysit their child, and it was $10 an hour. And then I'm sure if you go back in time, like 2 digits an hour was rich.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so I signed up to do that. And what's unique about St. Louis, which I think is there may be one other setup like this in the United States, but St. Louis has a whole district just for special education. It's called Special School District.
Hmm.
And that is different than any other place. So most districts, they service their own gen ed, general education services,
Yeah.
and they have their special ed team. Well, St. Louis has an entire district that's for special ed, and then they hire special ed staff, and then those staff go and get assigned to different county districts. So, for example, I'm now hired as a special school district para, but then they assign me to go work in Rockwood School District or Parkway School District.
Hmm.
And so there's this partnership. But what else is unique is that this district also has what we would call public separate schools, where only kids with IEPs can attend this. And
Hmm.
that's different than private separate. So most communities have private separate where the district pays for a kid that they can't service, right, to go over to this district.
Hmm.
While public separate, they're not paying. it's still a public school, but you have to have an IEP to get in it, and it's managed by a special school district. So the reason why I say that is because this was also a time where schools were, this conversation around 40 hours a week and ABA.
Right.
And the family that I was babysitting for, come to find out, sued the special school district for not providing ABA services for their child with autism.
Okay.
So not only were they monumental in a shift, but they were also well off financially. They were very influential. I was just trying to get $10 an hour. I didn't know that it connected to the Power family.
Yeah.
And so within that, when I started working at home, there were ABA, the school would provide ABA services at the home. Well, then I started pairing and learning those interventions to carry them at home. Then from there, the mom said, hey, I need an ABA para to be lead at the school. Go work there.
Yep.
And then the Power they had, and this was a white family. The dad was German, the mom was Italian. Just a very strong, influential family.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even have to do an interview.
Wow.
They just said, fill out paperwork. And I immediately was hired as a lead. So I got a promotion coming in.
Yeah.
And this is when ABA was still really loose as far as like managing it, right? And
Sure.
what the services look like. So I would be the role of an RBT today,
Yep.
but I would go work with him at school and then drive to his house and then service him at home under two different entities. And through that, then when I got ready to graduate with my bachelor's as an undergrad is in psychology and human services. So I did a double major. And my plan was social work and go help families that are divorced and kids that are in the system. But when I was getting ready to graduate, the associate behavior analyst at the time said, what are you getting ready to do for work? And I was like, I don't know. And she's like, hey, they're hiring associate behavior analyst, which is now our assistant behavior analyst. And then I knew I had not taken a class. The kid that I was working with didn't really have ABA programming implemented. It was just a lot of behavior interventions. And so I applied for that job and didn't know half the answers. But what I did know, I knew the practice. I just didn't know the terms. Right. And so I was just a learner. And so I got, right. Like, and so you're like, somebody's like, tell me what natural environment training is, NET. And I'm like, if you give me the definition, I can tell you how I apply it. Right. Like I was that candidate. So I started working as associate behavior analyst. I got hired and I quickly learned I knew nothing about programming. Right. But I'm responsible for like 30 kids.
Wow.
And so I just delve a lot into workshops and conferences. And then finally in 2011, I was like, I should probably get my master's. Now, mind you, I was doing this work at that point for 4 years.
Yeah.
No education other than experience and collaborating. I was like, I should probably get my master's. So I did that while working. And then I became an ABA coordinator. So more of the administrative role. And that was really cool because I was able to oversee the trainer position, but then I really had to learn how to be a supervisor, which was a BCBAs, which was very different for BTs and paras. And so I always think about that experience when I hear about new BCBA supervising or opening clinics. And I go like, oh, like that's such a different skill set, right? And so that was a huge learning curve for me. And so but that also gave me just a lot of exposure. At that point, instead of having 30 kids, I had about 150 on caseload and probably about 9 behavior analysts-ish, 9 or 10. And so I did that until 2017. And then I was like, I really want to do something different. Like I was in special ed. At that point, I'd done autism and Downs and medical need, like just everything, right? Social emotional behavior. And I was like, I just really want to go on the general education side, but I don't know what that looks like.
Yeah.
And I knew somebody that was working in the early childhood center. And she's like, hey, I'm an administrator here. And she was a BCBA. And she said, I'm retiring. You should come apply. So I was like, cool, because I knew I wanted one district.
Yeah.
Just give me one group of people to coach. I don't want to switch districts. And so I did that for a year. And while I was on maternity leave that first year, my boss came to me and said, hey, we're looking to bring a behavior analyst onto the general education side for K-12. And we think great,
Wow.
but we also know you've done well in this current position. And so I thought about it then, and I contemplated it, and I just thought, at the end of the day, I remember wanting to get my master's in behavior analysis, not necessarily to service autism, because remember, I was doing that without it.
Yeah.
But by working in these districts, I would constantly have people say, hey, I know this kid isn't on your case, but can you help me? When I was an associate behavior analyst, I would sit on their PBIS teams, which wasn't required for me. I was helping co-teach, PBIS and FBAs as a system, right, for school district. And so I knew like I wanted to touch that realm.
Yeah.
And so this was an opportunity. And so I applied for that position, got that job, and it was literally taking an idea. Right? Because at that point, I'm amongst administrators and staff that they knew they wanted a behavior analyst, but didn't know how to use that. Right.
Yeah.
So I just created a whole system and structure that not only had impact, but the impact was enough that the cabinet, the Board of Education said, we need more of them. And so it went from just me as the only behavior analyst in a district of 22,000 to now we have 9.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Wow. Good for you. I've never even sort of heard of and behavior analysis in the States is so much different than it is anywhere else in the world. But I've never even heard of sort of behavior analysts being in general ed, and because it sort of all this comes from lawsuits like the one that your Greek Italian family was involved in, that sort of advocated for those kinds of services, and so and did the lawsuit, and so then they had to provide them. Like, how was it that they were even providing behavior analytic services in general ed?
It was a game changer, to say the least. And it is very rare. Like I right now to this day, and I can't say that I've dug under every rock. I don't know another team of behavior analysts that is 100% on the gen education side. I know a team that's in special ed.
Yep.
Right. So I didn't have a model. Now, I think what was very interesting is because there's a trust that you have to build. So in special ed, you're on an IEP, right? You're required. You're coming in and they already have some lens that they need you.
Yeah, right.
Or maybe they don't really want you, but the needs are so high that they're stressed.
Yeah.
Right. To where in gen ed, it has been a game changer because like I have to learn their world, which I did. I had to learn their world, but then I also had to realize that our science fits in this world and is more needed because really the charge that I was given was that, hey, we have kids that are being referred for IEP simply because of behavior issues. And our district was disproportionate when it came to Black boys.
Yeah. Yes.
So they were like, if you can be a source that intervenes before we go special ed, then maybe we can change trajectories.
Wow.
Right? Like maybe. And so that was enough for me. It wasn't, though we are disproportionate when it came to Black boys, and that was originally the main kids that were referred to me, we had changed so many trajectories. Like I literally, and so I say all that to say, realizing that the tools that we use and how we learn them in school, right? Like I'm not going to have a teacher do a token economy, a 1-to-1 ratio for 6 hours. Right? Like it's got to look different. It's got to be a different format. I have to test and tease out different options.
Yeah.
Because it's one teacher with 18 kids.
Yeah.
But I think the the coolest thing is two things. One, running a functional analysis in a classroom of 18 to 20 kids and actually see the teacher implement that was probably my best experience. It continues to be my team just finished running like 3 or 4 different functional analyses right now in the gen ed setting. Right. And I think we never even think about it that way because we only know about it through the research that is in with kids with high needs. Right.
Yeah.
But I would say the other component is that though there are some behavior analysts that consult with gen ed, right? Meaning that they're contracted on, they may not necessarily be hired on as staff. It's not a lot of conversation in the schooling, in our education. And so majority of the behavior analysts that have come to me and practicum students have no idea how to transfer reinforcement from a classroom, from like 4 kids with 5 adults, and how to not just implement it, but think about it in a way of this child doesn't have a disability, so they're not following a consistent frame. Their response, like our learning curve as as typical divergent, or typical neurotypical, I'm trying to get my words together, as neurotypical is so fluid. Right? Like it's ever changing and you get in this contingency and then you're building into that one. And then you're like, oh, well, let me try this. And there's just this robust experience of behaviors. And as behavior analysts, when only thing you're used to working with is kids with autism or kids with Downs, there's a steady responding that happens. And so to be able to coach and train practicum students and behavior analysts, how to be a scientist and how to take the science and actually apply it in a neurotypical, right? With neurotypicals or with trauma without the developmental delay.
Yeah.
But then even more so, there's a different communication skill and relationship building that has to be taught to collaborate with general education teachers. This is very different than special ed. And so, I would definitely say the processes are the same, but the tools and how we use them and the relationships that's built prior to even entering spaces is the turning piece, like the great difference between gen ed and special ed.
I mean, it makes sense. I remember my graduate advisor. She was teaching a class one day. She was talking to me about how, all ABA is. She just simplified ABA to being, just really good, really clean teaching. And I asked her, so why don't gen ed teachers take special ed courses? Like, why don't they learn those skills in their bachelor's degrees? If this is all just, I think about precision teaching as another great example of, it's an actual sort of realm of ABA that's all about really precise, specific teaching. And she said to me, well, Ben, the special education department and the education department are on the same floor here at the university, and we don't talk to each other. That department doesn't want anything to do with us, and we want everything to do with them, but they just don't want us anywhere near them. And so I would imagine, it's a similar vibe in these gen ed classrooms where, this behavior analyst is coming in and their only association with behavior analysis is also autism or special ed, and kind of wondering why is a special educator in our classroom? We don't have special ed students in here. And so like, how did you even start to build that relationship and get buy-in from these folks when you're already sort of, climbing up a hill?
Yeah, I would I think is some of the things we talk about in our science about pairing, right? And so I started attending, like over the summer, they had different teacher trainings, right? On the curriculum, whether it was ELA or whether it was, they actually would have some trainings on classroom management. And I'd be like, let me go see what they're talking about. Right? So I would put myself in these trainings. I would attend staff meetings, even if I didn't have to, right? And keep in mind, I'm district wide, so I'm not assigned to a certain school. We have at least 35 buildings. So a lot of it was learning their language. One of the things that I think that really stood out was that my first year in this position, I actually hired on a paraprofessional. We called her a behavior assistant, but she was a para who actually was a certified teacher. And so she and I did a lot of conversations because I would say, hey, I want to build a lesson plan where teachers are thinking about how they're doing behavior interventions the same way they're doing academic interventions. So then she pulled her documents and would say, hey, this is a sample of a lesson plan that we're taught to use. Let's keep this frame, but then change the language. And so now you're not building muscle memory around a whole new framework. It's just the language. Nice. And so I learned to talk their language. So I would sit in there and I would say, okay, well, what's the EOC? Right? Like, and I sit in there and go, okay, so you were in your PLC. What did that conversation sound like? Like, I learned their acronyms.
Nice.
Right?
Yeah.
And then I would say things like, okay, so you took data when you did this formative assessment. Here's an example of a formative assessment for behavior. And so when you can talk someone's language, right? But then you just add the science to it, then it put us in line because they knew I wasn't there to just sell an agenda. I was there to help meet them where they were and move them forward. Yeah. And so we've had teachers that have gone through my process that said, I was so afraid you were just going to tell me what I wasn't doing right. You were going to just make me, change my whole system. And I think that that's the key piece. And I've had teammates come in and say, oh, well, the teacher gives out these puff balls, but this kid, he needs a whole token, a separate system. And I said, why can't he just earn puff balls?
Yeah.
At a higher frequency. like, why does all of his rewards have to be out of the classroom? Like, the kids are allowed to earn extra recess. They're allowed to earn free time. Like, let's have connect him to the classroom system. And then he rewards the class with the extra recess. And so it's just thinking collectively and pulling the systems together.
Yeah.
And so I would say it wasn't easy at first. Like, I had principals that didn't want me in their building.
Yeah.
I went to one school and I'm like, hey, looking to see what needs you have. And I see this kid sprint down the hallway and out the door. And the teacher's like, oh yeah, the principal's like, he's been running out the school like 5 times a day. And I said, well, were we going to go see him? And she's like, no, we're going to get him sent to the autism special classroom. Like, special ed is going to handle that. You can come look at this kid. And I said, no, I want him.
Yeah.
I want the kid that's running out the school. And so I think I did have flexibility, so really my team, as long as a student is at least 75% gen ed and their behavior concerns are in the gen ed setting, we can service them. And so I think that was a plus. Also, with me having been in special education, the special school district here for so long, I could talk their language. When I was an administrator in early childhood, that was gen ed, right? So I'm joining all of the admins right? So I learned their language. And then now I just had to sit and watch a teacher's lesson and go to their training sessions. And so I think it's the shift that realizing we have a great science, but we don't know everything. we don't really know how to tie it in until we learn someone else's world.
Yeah.
And when I can now sit and speak general education teacher language, right? Or I can tell a principal, hey, this is the intervention we want to do, but you guys are getting ready to do MAP testing in 2 weeks. And you just finished STAR testing and you're about to send 4 different grade levels on field trips. I'm thinking we should wait and run it next week. And they're like, oh my God, thank you, Charda'e. Right? To where I think as behavior analysts, we have our own timelines and we have our plans and how we want to do that, which is not effective in the gen ed setting.
Yeah. Super cool.
Yeah.
I'd like to know a little bit more about what this FA in the general ed classroom looked like. That sounds really cool. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Absolutely. It's the coolest thing ever. So, so what we do is we run different FAs. So I usually tell my team, like, we have our standards. So we know like what a latency is and a trial base and the ISCA. And so I just tell my team, you're just going to create the FA that makes sense for this kid. Like, I don't need a title.
Yeah.
We're just going to create it.
Yeah. And
so within that, what it typically looks like, we usually do the observations. And so I can give an example of one kid just recently. When we were looking at through observations, it kept being like, if he didn't have something he needed, he would flip out. Or if he had to end something he really enjoyed, right? He'd flip out. Well, ending something, we're like, oh, that's access, right? And so, but not having something he needed, I was like, well, like, so we drafted it up and we just called it incomplete material or something. Like we just labeled it as incomplete material, which looks like access.
Yeah.
So what we do is that we meet with the team, including parents, and we're saying, hey, we get our consent up front.
Yeah.
And so we draft out the protocol. And for the most part, majority of our FAs the time frame is a latency. There's been some times when we've run it as a brief and we've done like multiple within a session.
Yeah.
But usually the kids, they're quick responding. So I say all that to say, what we do is we draft up the conditions. There's always a control condition, so we don't change that. But we really think about when is it going to happen and who's the person that's going to interact with this kid about it. So if it's a demand and I'm testing demand, well, I already know the classroom teacher is the one that's more likely to give the demand.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to have the classroom like pull in me or somebody else to do it. Mm-hmm. But if it's a kid that earns reward breaks, then typically that's somebody coming into the classroom and coming to get them. Well, we have them take control, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so what we do is we train. So we'll meet with the people that's going to implement. Yep. We'll train them on their condition and how to make it look. And then we have them either wear a hat or a scarf to signal the condition shifts. And so, of course, the kids will say, like, why do you have on a hat? And then we just train the teacher to say, well, when I put this hat on, it makes me do things differently. And so usually one of us are in the classroom to signal the teacher. Yeah. But we also have district cameras we can use now. And so sometimes we'll just view from the camera and we'll just be on the phone with the teacher. But it's really cool because when you start delineating the different variables, the confounding variables that happen in one situation, right? Like I'm drawing, you're asking me to put away my drawing and get out my math book and stop talking. And then you walked away when I'm asking you questions. So you're moving attention, right? Yeah. And so it's been interesting because we'll have a thought like, oh, this behavior is going to be triggered by demand. And this kid, we thought that. We thought, it's demand, but then there's some access, but then he doesn't have all the material he needed. His demand condition was golden. Like it hit 300 seconds, the full 5 minutes. Yep. And then when we would take an item from him, it only hit when it was a technology. So you take his headphones, he could care less. Yeah. You take his pencil, he's like, wait, what happened? Because he wanted to keep pace with the class. Right. And so, and we set up the incomplete. So we get to kind of play with it. But I think the other piece is that we get to also do a compare contrast. So meaning that I had a student who we didn't know whether it was for the teacher's attention or the admin attention. Mm. But then we didn't want to wait to trigger her behavior and then test it in the office. And so what we did was we ran the condition of attention in the classroom. So, and the teachers give voice on when they want to run it. Yep. So we plan it ahead of time. And the teachers are phenomenal. Like they'll set up like, okay, everybody, you're going to do independent work time. I'm going to walk around and check on you. And then we keep them in a certain parameter of the target student. They interact with that student first and then say, okay, I'm going to go check on other kids. And this, students like, hey, look at this map. Look at what I did. Right. So it's truly the exact conditions that we run. It's just in a classroom of 25.
So these other students don't know this is happening.
No, they'll look around. They'll ask, why is the scarf happening? And teacher goes, oh, just because, So one classroom, the teacher told the kids they could do free choice as we were trying to do access. And it was a 4th grade class. And she said, you can either draw or get a book out. Well, those were 2 things we knew the student wanted to do. The class was always willing. Yeah. So once we start, the student picks drawing. Once we start the condition, right, the teacher comes, she's talking to the student for a minute and she's like, okay, and I'm just going to take this. And she took the drawing paper out of her hand. Right. And so the student's like, why would you do that? I wasn't done drawing. And then the peers are looking and they're kind of whispering to each other like, what's going on? And so what we did was we didn't see the behavior. The two student just kind of complained.
Yeah.
But what we did is that we actually had the teacher, once we ended that condition, got the student cool, I sent the teacher to just go do it to another student.
Mm.
I said, hey, I just want you to like go over there and just take so-and-so's writing, just so that way they don't think you're picking on the
Yeah,
student.
yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't want that to be a report going home.
Yeah.
Right. And so when she did that, then the other kids were like, oh, okay, she's just kind of talking to everybody, but removing their work while she does it.
Mm.
So sometimes we have to do a little extra
Yeah.
to minimize the impact on the other kids that are viewing it. But keep in mind too, by the time we're running a functional analysis on this kid in the gen ed setting, this kid has already set it off so many times. Their peers are like, there's something else.
Yeah.
But we've also can do treatment analyses. Like we've done, a multi-element where we've tested 2 different interventions and the control is business as usual. And we've tested 2 different interventions to make sure we know which one we want to do. Like I will say it's freeing. Like so when people get caught up in like, I've had people go, so do you run the ISCA? Do you run, which one? I'm like, I run and design whatever I want for the needs of this kid. And at the end of the day, it's a functional analysis, right? Because sometimes we do an escape to access if that's what we're seeing.
Yeah.
It's just, it's cool. And then the teachers, I think it helps them because they have their thoughts of, oh, it's for access. Oh, this is going to piss this kid off. And it doesn't. So then when we get into intervention, right, because the teacher's been part of all of the conditions. So now we start talking about intervention, they're all in because they've seen it play out, right? They're into the data and they're excited and their team, their grade level team is wanting to know what's going on. And so it just builds a community that I think, when I talk to some other behavior analysts and they go, I don't really have time to run a functional analysis.
Mm.
Or I've had some people say, I don't even know. I haven't run one since grad school.
Yeah.
And I think it's really not that hard if you do it, but if you do it the way it needs to be, it's going to yield. That's why it's a gold standard. It's going to yield you more results than direct observation. And it puts the person implementing more mentally ready for intervention because they've experienced all the conditions. So I don't run them. We just coach the adults to do it.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really dope. It's so cool.
There's so much I love about this. And also just as an aside, I'm 150 plus episodes in. This started as kind of an ABA podcast. It's something else now, but I've never talked about functional analysis until today.
Really?
Yeah. So this is awesome. Because but it's really interesting. Yeah, really funny, but I'm glad I waited. Because this is super cool. A couple things I like the whole I don't care if it's the ISCA or the brief or the trial or the whatever, and I think this is, and I'm not trying to get on a soapbox about some of these sort of well-branded, FA methodologies that are out there. I know they've been really helpful to a lot of children and a lot of folks and work really well, but they do sort of, I think I do worry that we are now sort of creating a mentality in behavior analysts that there is only one way to do it, and it's this way because it's it's the current one that people are talking about. I know, and I've heard other conversations from other behavior analysts who are saying, like, this isn't new. We've been doing this stuff forever. It's just packaged in a different way, and so I like that you're coming in this from a science perspective versus a branding perspective, which I think is really important. I do wonder about sort of what it was like, sort of to get buy-in from the teachers and whatnot to do it the first time. I could see after doing one, they're going, "Oh, this is awesome." where have you been all our lives, Charda'e? Because this is great. We're getting the tools, we're seeing it in action. It's awesome. But I think that is a barrier. That is a barrier for some folks to do FAs of any kind, whether they're branded or not. Is kind of getting the buy-in to try it first. Now, I imagine the answer to the question is similar to the question I asked you earlier about how do you get the buy-in to have a behavior analyst in a general ed classroom, and it's building relationships and using their lingo and whatnot. But an FA is different. An FA is you're setting folks up to engage in the challenging behavior, and that's always a barrier for folks. And so I'm curious about how you navigated that early on.
Yeah, and you're right, it is different, right? So yes, it helps to have a relationship, but you can have the best relationship and they're gonna look at you and be like, I'm not pissing that kid off.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And so my language, full transparency, is I say to them, listen, we wouldn't be here if there wasn't something that's happening that's pissing them off or that they're getting on the back end. So the reality is that the behavior is going to happen.
Yeah.
What you now have an opportunity to do is with coaching and with all eyes on you, right? And all eyes on the circumstance and all hands on deck, is we separate out what's happening. Like we kind of put it more in a structured situation and we tease it out to figure out what really is triggering it. What is the student getting out of it? I said, otherwise, what's going to happen is that you're going to still keep getting the same thing. And what we're seeing is because the behavior is increasing, it's working for the student, but it's driving you crazy. You're struggling. And so I tell them, like, we're not introducing anything new to your environment.
Yeah.
And that's usually the first way I lead. Like, there's nothing new introduced. We're taking what you're already doing. We're just going to control how it's presented. We're going to determine when it's presented. And I tell them, I said, because we're going to reinforce it immediately, like if the behavior happens, we're going to respond immediately, then you're less likely to see the behavior hit this high increase because it's immediately coming in contact with reinforcement, if that's what it's for. So the moment that, we're going to do throwing, is the behavior. Well, the moment that pencil releases from his hand, you're telling me he don't have to do it if we're in a demand condition.
Yeah.
Or you're giving attention to where, because you're teaching a class of 20, he or she is engaged in all these behaviors that you didn't respond to, that now they're on 10.
Yeah.
And so I help them to see that it's actually a safety measure, right? And I've had conversations with other behavior analysts and they go, well, but I'm not going to do it if the behavior is aggression. I'm not going to do the behavior, self-interest behavior. And I say to them, like, I know you think that that's a higher level behavior, and so it doesn't make sense to trigger it. But the fact that you're even having a conversation to do a functional analysis means that it's happening at a high frequency. Yeah. So it's actually more unethical, in my opinion, to not run a functional analysis, to throw a general intervention on it when you already know that they're engaging in it. Like, people are getting.
Yeah.
So I'm more likely, if the behavior is aggression, eloping, I'm more likely to run the functional analysis on those levels because I need the intervention to be clear, right? And so with the teachers, I tell them, I say, hey, listen, when you go and you separate your students into reading groups, right? I said, do you just randomly go, hey, I'm just going to put everybody in group A versus B or C? Like, how do you come up with your reading groups? And they always, because I know what they do. They do reading assessments. You do a reading assessment. You find out what reading level they're on.
Nice.
Group the kids based on their reading level. And I said, how would you group intervention or responding or even know where to put the kid in the classroom if you don't do a behavior assessment?
Yeah.
And they're like, I didn't think about it like that. And so I think when you can give them the confidence of, this is your solution. Like, this is your STAR test.
Yeah.
This is your MAP test. Like, this is your formative, right? And then you don't have to, and I tell teachers, you're part of your frustrations because you don't know what's pissing them off and you don't know what's making them happy. So you're coming into your own classroom traumatized,
right,
and walking on eggshells. And so let me help you know which egg to not step on or how to navigate that egg. And so when they can understand, she's not going to ask me to do anything new. We're just going to take what I'm already doing, but tease it out there's going to be eyes on my classroom, right? Like I'm not in this alone. And when we practice it, I think because most educators are perfectionists, most educators did really well in school, right? um, not all, but most,
Yeah.
they're studying the conditions. You know, they got their cards ready, and it's literally just the first round of conditions that they're nervous,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um, and so once they run through it, they finally go, oh, that's not bad. And the
Yeah.
condition that they hate the most, which this is funny, the condition that I consistently see teachers struggle with is when they have to do a play control condition and cannot ask questions, but have to interact with the kids.
Right.
Because they're like, I just want to ask them, so what did you do last weekend? Oh, so how did you draw that? Well, show me. I'm like, no, those are demands. You can't. And they're like, oh, I can't teach. I'm supposed to talk to them normal. I'm like, yes. But it's been interesting because it's been some of those conditions that we start seeing the teacher-student relationship develop.
Yeah.
Because you're not asking me to do anything. You're just experiencing my world. And so it even in the conditions where there are no target behaviors, have been data to use to shift either the teacher or plan intervention. Like it is. So
Love
really, I
it.
think, you know, when you ask just how to introduce it, we just have to not make it scary. And we just tell them it's what you're doing. We're just going to control when it happens so you can get a clear picture. And when they know it's for them, they're more willing.
Yeah. And what added value to sort of, you know, get some learning out of the one condition that doesn't mean anything, you know? Like that's the one condition that actually doesn't do anything for our assessment, but it's still an assessment in a way. It's still giving us information that's going to improve your relationship with this kid down the road. I mean, can this thing get any more efficient?
Yeah. And I think if we really realize that as behavior analysts,
Yeah.
right? If we really realize how I think when we think about FAs, we're focused on the time or the resource, which really doesn't take resources for real. But we're so worried about the manipulation of it, right? And I mean, to be fully transparent, there's been kids that we've been able to turn it on and I struggle turning it off. Right. And that's where, you know, multiple blends and really looking at, okay, well, let's do escape to access to get it to stop. Right.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely fully transparent. Every functional analysis hasn't just been golden and perfect and clear.
Sure.
And there has been times where we're like, we turned it on, but I don't know how to turn this off. Right. And so, but you keep running conditions and you create new conditions to turn it off.
Yeah.
But I think that if we really understood the power, right, of clarity
Yeah.
that we gain from running a functional analysis, not just the right way, but very individualized,
Yeah.
I do think we would lean in more because otherwise we're just throwing interventions and it's sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And there's a different confidence as a behavior analyst when you go, oh, behavior only happened in this condition. Like it is access. And I know that, right? Like, you can write a plan that's not a shotgun plan, right? That kind of just covers everything.
Yeah.
But so many relationships have been restored because now you have the teacher who's moving for the student, and you have the student who is moving with the teacher in an environment that's working.
The second secret word is Chicago.
And it's all because we ran a functional analysis.
So cool.
Yeah.
I also, what was sort of the feeling of the teachers? Because I can picture this, so the teachers coming in just knowing or thinking they know, exactly why this behavior's happened. I got it. And you're going to see too now. Now you're going to see, Charda'e, what I already knew. And that he's doing it for this. And
Yeah.
then they find out that he's not. What's that like for them?
It's jaw dropping. Like I literally saw teachers go, he didn't, I can't believe he tolerated, I just drilled him with math demands for 5 minutes. I can't believe he didn't throw the pencil at me, right?
Yeah.
And they're just like shocked. And I said, but keep in mind that when you were giving him the work demands, you were also shifting attention and talking to another kid because they came up to you, which then delayed him getting the help he needed. Like he just wants to do work. He's okay with the demand. He just want to get it done, and you're delaying that.
Yeah.
And so it's like it creates this opportunity for me to help them to see, like, let's look at all the other variables you had in place. But they are shocked. And then I've had some teachers that says, well, I think he only just didn't do that because, this math lesson was easy. And I'm like, okay, well, let's do another one. Or they're like, well, it's Friday. Usually it's on Monday. Okay, well, we'll run the condition on Monday. So sometimes it's met with, this part is missing. And I think that that's the joy of an FA, because you're like, okay, let's do that. And it's just, they're shocked. They're just like, oh my God, I thought it was this. And I just knew she wanted my attention. No, you were just giving it. She can care less.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that that's where it also, for some of them, I've had some teachers say, like, oh, like I feel like the weight has been lifted. Like I don't feel like I have to guess how to move with this kid. I just want to know what to do.
Yeah.
And so those have been some of the reactions over, and then I have to coach them through, because if we don't, one kid recently, we didn't see any of the target behaviors in any of the conditions. And the teacher was like, well, we're just wasting time. And I said, no, think about it. Like, we're not seeing any of the target behaviors, and yet it's very structured and it's isolated. So that means there has to be multiple conditions happening at once that's triggering it. But we just had to fine tune out, like it wasn't just one singular.
Yeah.
She's like, oh, I didn't think about that. I say, yeah. So like now we get to play, like get the foundation done. And then like, now we get to play. But what we do know is that when you address her and you only lean in on no attention, or you only lean on demand, she can tolerate it. It's you just doing too much.
Right. So we pile it on. Yeah.
Yeah. You're piling it on. You're making this too much. And so I think being analytical enough to help people to see the data when there, quote unquote, is no data, right? Like there's no behavior hit, but it's data. And so those have been some of the reactions for sure that we've had. And I think that that's, as an educator, those are the experiences you never forget.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and again, I'm sure there's lots of functional analysis, practitioners out there that know way more than I do. But as far as sort of, the promotion of these practices, these days I tend to either hear about look for one function, or it's all the functions all at once, all the time. These kind of synthesized contingencies that they talk about, which are cool. I mean, it's cool. It's a cool concept, but I don't know that it's actually, and again, I'm level -7 on the sort of FTF scale of folks that are good at this stuff. So I could be saying this wrong, but it doesn't seem like they in the end it doesn't seem like they actually know why the individual's doing what they're doing. They just know if they throw all this stuff at them, they'll stop doing it. In a way, and while on one hand, I guess it only takes a couple minutes to figure that out. If things are working out right, they're not really getting any sort of specifics on what's happening. Whereas I haven't heard a lot about sort of what if it's two things, and that seems different to me, and that seems kind of unique.
Yeah, and I think when you can at least pause and capture that,
Yeah.
you start remembering how complex as humans we are,
Yeah.
right? Because yeah, I love gifts, but like I want a gift and I want a hug and I want to say thank you,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
I want, like think about Mother's Day just
Yeah.
passing, right? And I just imagine how many those variables how many of the potential functions that we talk
Absolutely.
about came in play. Like, did somebody take work off their hands
Yeah.
and give them access to a spa day,
Yeah.
and gave them attention one-on-one that they don't usually get it. Like, I think that
Yeah.
sometimes, and I think it's that we are complex, and yet there's certain situations where either this one or multiple carry more value for me,
Yeah.
right? Whether it's my learning history or what I need in this moment, which kind of goes hand in hand, right? And so I think that that's interesting because
Yeah.
we have, and that's why I say it's so interesting to run an FA with students who don't have autism. Now, some
Mm-hmm.
of them have, right? But with students who don't have autism and
Yeah.
don't have Downs, but specifically autism, they're not methodical,
Yeah.
right? And they're going to switch and they're going to vary in certain situations because it's thinking happening, right? Not
Yeah.
that kids with autism don't think, but you know what I'm saying. Like,
Yeah.
there's just this ongoing learning component for them,
Yeah.
without any repetition.
Yeah.
And so I think when you have to learn how to capture what this, neurotypical individual is getting out of this circumstance,
Mhm.
start, you start structured to kind of rule out, but then, yeah, you have to
Yeah.
start stacking because we're complex.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
And not to put you on the spot here, but do you know if there is any kind of research that around like that has around FAs with sort of folks without disabilities?
Yeah, I'd have to pull there. I will say we did a lot of research in trying to find like FAs around like school refusal,
Yep.
and things like that. And a lot of those are more of like the self-report,
Yep.
right? Like, it's not a full FA. It's just kind of like, here are some functions potential to answers. Um, I'm gonna say I couldn't tell you off the top of my
Mm.
head like what articles and what researches.
No,
I can
no, yeah.
definitely say it's not a lot for me that I've seen.
Well,
I've seen some with typical, but more in like the home early
yeah,
learner
yeah.
stage, like early intervention, but in the home. I can't say I've seen a lot that's typical in a school setting.
The reason I ask is it seems like a lot of the research, sort of the behavior analytic research anyway, in kind of the general classroom seems to be more that PBIS kind of focus,
Mhm. Yeah.
which is great stuff, big systems things and whatnot. But I also know, just from my experience in sort of the realm of PBS, that in PBS functional analyses aren't done a lot. And it is a lot more of the sort of indirect and and observations and sort of descriptive assessments and those kinds of things, that lead to sort of those results. And so this seems like an area that needs some writing done.
Yeah, I felt that comment. I was had a couple of teammates and even Dr. Parks, like a couple of people were just like, can you please publish? Like, can you
Yeah,
please write this up?
yeah,
And I think, just my own level sometimes of insecurities of like, job is not going to pick this up. It wasn't
yeah,
that controlled or whatever. And then I'm looking at some of the data. I'm like, oh, that day looks awesome.
yeah. And I wouldn't put this in Java. I'd be publishing this in one of those journals that the teachers are
Education.
reading.
Oh, that's
Right?
a good. Yeah,
You
I didn't
know,
even think about
yeah,
that.
because this is who it's valuable for sure. Really, really neat stuff. Do you do, just on an aside? Do you also do like the PBIS kind of systems and stuff at the schools you're working at, or is that sort of too much for what you're? Because I know you folks are all sort of district behavior analysts. So it's you're not really running one school, which, would be a lot easier if you were just sort of in, so-and-so elementary school and you can kind of do all that sort of thing. But do you do that, and or are you working in schools that have those systems in place?
So I would say that specifically the district that I'm in, PBIS has kind of been like this don't say word in the district.
Mm.
I think that, as the structure is ideal, it was designed to be able to help schools kind of get systems in place without constantly calling the behavior analyst in. Well, the limitation, though, is that the expertise of a behavior analyst is not consistently present.
Yes.
And so when that's the case, now they're at phase 3 or, tier 3, and they're trying to come up with interventions, and interventions aren't working because they don't really understand the science. They're just picked out of a bag based on what they perceive the function to be.
Yes.
And so I think it within itself has been a limitation for schools.
Yeah.
However, I think to answer your question on a different angle, though we don't necessarily have PBIS, what my team does do is that we have really been more intentional on what are the tiers of intervention. And so a lot of our conversation today has been about like how we service and look at individual student teams.
Yeah.
And I think what's cool about my team is that we actually service on class-wide. The principal can say, hey, or a teacher can say, hey, I got 3 kids bubbling up, or the principal can say, I got this teacher that's struggling with classroom management, and we'll come observe the class and coach the teacher on how to shift dynamics in the class, whether that's working on getting them the transition, within a certain time frame, or having kids quiet, or, like participate in a structured way during whole group, or just things like that. So we do class-wide. We also do grade level. So there's been times like we had a 6th grade team come in and they're like, or asked us to come in because they were just like, these kids are sprinting through the hallways. Like it's like full force sprinting. And the teachers are like, we tell them to stop, they don't. And so we actually observed, and through our process, we stationed the adults in certain spots. We gave them a language for what to say, like a full script, like that kid runs, you're going to say, hey, you're running, turn around and walk back. But we empowered all the teachers to do that. They had this ticket system, so we made them make it rain tickets. Every teacher had to get rid of 5 tickets per passing period. But before they implemented the intervention, we actually supported them with coming up with a PowerPoint that was presented to the whole 6th grade class and their individual ELA classes, so that when the kids hit the hallway, they knew somebody's going to tell you if you're running to turn around and walk. And so we did that. And I would consider that like that PBIS, right? Like it's like a level. And so we just saw a drastic drop in running. And so that was the teacher's like, oh, well, I need to do this in my class. And how do I get them in a class ready to go? And then we've also done building. We do building level as another service we provide. And so there was one middle school that was struggling with kids getting into fights and just going crazy at breakfast in the lunch. And so we interviewed students. We did a blind selection of students, and we did interviews, got their voice and their interactions with the adults and what they would want to earn in the school. We worked with the administration on different, like how to do a progress assessment and reinforcement system. And then we actually coached them to restore relationships. We then start having the adults, because they were focused on one group of kids. And so we started having them walk around, and then each adult had to initiate a positive interaction. And it's specifically, just to call it out, they were struggling with the Black kids. But all their interactions with the Black kids were corrective. So I was like, so we put them on an intervention where administration had to go and do 5 initiations every morning with the Black kid that couldn't include a redirection. They just had to come up and say, hey, what's up? Love your Jordans today. And then keep it moving. So that was like a building level. We've done a few of those. And then, we also do professional development trainings in different content for building and district wide. So we're hitting every level.
You are.
It's not quite PBIS, but I would probably say it's definitely more involved and engaged and targeted than what you would anticipate in a generalized structure.
Love what you're doing, Charda'e. It's so cool.
It's fun.
Well, I mean, also, again, I think you're I think you're kind of what behavior analysts are supposed to be. you know, and again, the whole description of the functional analysis and how you're not worried about sort of, doing one that way or doing one name that way and doing that thing. PBIS is the same. PBIS has really, in a way, developed a brand, and it's a scary brand because not scary in the sense of it can lead to a lot of problems, but scary in that it's daunting. It's you got to get 80% buy-in from the entire school team at minimum. You got to have all these sort of systems in place and this and that and the other. And if you don't get all that stuff in place, it's not going to work. It's sometimes kind of the message. That might not be the case, but that's often the message. And so people are just kind of afraid to even go there. But what you're doing again is you're just taking those principles and you're applying them where they work. And you're doing classroom PBS and lunchroom PBS and and playground PBS and their building PBS and not so much worried about meeting all the outcomes to get to 35,000 schools with full implementation, and 17 different journal articles written, and shout out to Kent McIntosh and all
Absolutely.
those and Erica McDowell and all those folks out there, that Nikole Hollins and Nikole Hollins-Sims and all these folks that have had the podcast. They're all doing amazing, great work. And that's your niche and you're brilliant at it. But the fact that you're also doing all of that too, but not worrying about sort of being all of that is super awesome.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I definitely think, as you referenced, that it's a different vibe when you're on the staff.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that that's the difference. Like,
yes.
One thing to come in as a contractor or consulting company and say,
Yes.
hey, here's what you need to put in place, and then we'll
Yes.
train you guys and then we'll check on you.
Yes.
Right. To where, because I'm like I'm on with the district. So I'm shoulder to shoulder.
Yes.
And to bring it back full circle, it just feels different when you can say, hey, this is the intervention you're going to run or that I'm recommending, but I'm going to be right next to your shoulder. Like when I ask an admin, hey, this is the protocol when you get walkie called, we're going down together. Yeah. Right. Or they're going to role play with me before that walkie call. So I know that they got muscle memory. Right. And so I think that looks and feels different than the system, right? When you can help them implement it. And so I do think that, and that's, I think, to kind of go back full circle, there's not a lot of behavior analysts on the gen education side. I don't know if we're fully trained to just enter the gen education side. And nonetheless, it is a space that if we're willing and we're humble and we're eager, not only can we impact the gen education side, but at least from my experience, we're actually impacting the special ed because there has been multiple kids that we have worked with teams on who, had we not got involved, would have an IEP in kindergarten and be labeled emotional disturbed, right? And yet I've had multiple kids, not one or two, like 4, 5, 6, 10, that we worked with them, their behavior shift, the teacher's behavior shift. Not only do they not have an IEP, but they're moving through the district and through schools in 4th grade, 6th grade.
Yeah.
Right? Without an IEP. Like, that's huge. That's a different trajectory.
Yeah.
Or their IEPs being faded out because they've just been, like, we've adjusted the environment, right? Like, and so I think it's a different angle that we can support when we take the science and shift it, but it's definitely a learning curve, and one that we'd have to be humble enough to go, I don't know this world, but if I just listen and if I'm exposed, I can learn it and I can apply the science. And I think that's the win, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So cool, Charda'e. So cool. The last secret word for continuing education credits is emphasis. I'm all out of paper. This is awesome.
You know what I think is funny, and I don't know if you remember this, but I'm going to bring it back full circle, and you may include this pending. But I think when you originally reached out to me last year, because it took us a while to pull it together, it was after I did a training on supervision and how to be diverse in our approach for supervision.
Yep.
And
it was WEBA.
Yeah. It was WEBA. And I think what I love about connecting with you, Ben, and just listening to Behavior Podcast, like, is that it's such an authentic conversation, right? That I think you can't really get anywhere else. I mean, not saying that other podcasts don't capture that, but as I sit and I reflect, I wouldn't have thought our conversation would have got here, but it's such a rich conversation. And you can probably just see me still smiling. Like, I love the work that has been done, and there's so many layers. And I just think it's that moment where you pause and you go, if you're just willing to expand as behavior analysts, science really can just do everything. So I appreciate you leaning in and posing some of those questions, because it's a joy. And when I think about where we started for First Contact and where we are in this conversation, I'm like, this is dope. Even though I wouldn't have put us here, I love it. And I think that that's the value of how your podcast go and why it's been so, been able to sustain for so long. So hats off to you.
Oh, well, thank you. How can I not leave this in?
I mean, it is relevant. I just thought I'd give you space to choose.
Yeah.
No. All about choices.
Oh, I really appreciate it. Thanks so much, Charda'e. And thanks for coming on the podcast. It was super cool. We're going to do this again for sure.
Yeah, I'm open for it. Again, I think it's when you start talking and you're just like, oh yeah, this and this. And it's like, to be able to share an experience and to have somebody be just as excited, I think is my reinforcement. So I appreciate that. And I look forward to us running this back for sure.
Absolutely. Cool. Thanks again.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed this episode with Charda'e Pearson. I've got a few other episodes that I think you might find interesting on related topics. The first one is episode 49, recorded back in 2022 with Dr. Nicole Hollins, where she talks about her work in equitable, multi-tiered, positive behavioral interventions and supports in school settings. Really cool interview and good introduction to sort of PBIS. Another one you might want to check out is my conversation with May Beaubrun in episode 62, where we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the education system. You also might want to check out episode 114, Equity, Belonging, and Inclusion with Dr. Nikole Hollins-Sims. Also, you might want to check out episode 115, Microaggressions, a primer with Dr. Brea Banks. And finally, checking out maybe episode 138, Culturally Responsive, Positive Behavior Intervention and Supports with Dr. Rachelle Campbell. Thanks again for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please follow us on Instagram @BehaviorSpeak.